Good evening to everyone in Australia and good morning to those in the US and also good morning to friends in Europe. My name is Michelle Maloney and I'm really delighted to welcome you to our webinar this evening on Earth Jurisprudence in Practice. In a moment, I'll introduce our wonderful speakers, but first I'm just going to open up some slides so that I can acknowledge country. Please bear with me. So firstly, I'd like to thank you for joining us as part of Earth Laws Month. I can see a lot of friendly, familiar faces. And the Australian Earth Laws Alliance has been delighted to host, I think we've just hit 35 events throughout September, where I can see some of my colleagues and staff nodding, and we're getting a bit webinar crazy. It's been really great fun. So thank you for being part of it. And if you're not familiar with Earth Laws Month, do visit our website. The link is right here. And I'm sure Christina, welcoming Christina Myers, part of AILA, will pop that in the chat for you. Tonight, as I mentioned, we're having a lovely discussion about Earth Jurisprudence in Practice. I'm going to give these lovely ladies a proper introduction in a moment. But as is the tradition in Australia and New Zealand and Canada and other places with a colonial legacy, I'm very proud to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal First Nations peoples. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, the emerging leaders and elders, and acknowledge the remarkable civilizational culture that has cared for country and cared for kin since time immemorial. In the work that we do, we always acknowledge also the ongoing legacy and impacts of colonisation and the hard work that we're all trying to do at the moment in Australia, tackling what our future looks like as we bridge those cultural and historical differences to share all the beauty and wonder of our continent together. But tonight, I'm really delighted to invite Carlotta Byrne from the Gaia Foundation in the UK and Margaret Stewart from the Centre for Earth Jurisprudence in the US to share with us their stories about the work that their organisations and they themselves do. And particularly delighted, of course, because my organisation, our organisation, AILA, is built on one of the two big branches of the work that we do. Is one side is Earth Jurisprudence and the other side is inspired by the First Nations peoples of Australia. So tonight, Carlotta is going to speak with you first, and I'll let her introduce herself. We all wear many hats, so I think it's nice if folks can share the bits of themselves that they would like to. And Carlotta's going to talk about the work of the Gaia Foundation, including the wonderful work they do in Africa. And then we'll turn to Margaret Stewart, and she's going to talk about the work they do at the Centre for Earth Jurisprudence, an absolutely wonderful place that I had the privilege to teach and work at many moons ago in early 2015, I think. So without further ado, I shall stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Carlotta. I'll take the spotlight off Margaret and myself so we can sit back and relax and enjoy the chat. So over to you, Carlotta. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, so much for the invitation to join this session today and this discussion on Earth Jurisprudence in Practice, and to make a contribution to Earth Laws Month amongst so many wonderful speakers. So it's a real privilege to be here with you and Margaret and with all of our guests today. So I'm Carlotta and I am part of the Earth Jurisprudence team at the Gaia Foundation. Today I'd like to offer an introduction to Earth Jurisprudence and to explore some examples of Earth Jurisprudence in practice by introducing the work of the African Earth Jurisprudence Collective. So what is Earth Jurisprudence? Well, I'd like to begin with a short story, and I want to invite you to imagine it's an afternoon in late May, many years ago, and a young boy is wading across the stream near his home in North Carolina, and he enters a meadow. This meadow is thick with tall grasses, there are lots of wildflowers, there's a bright blue sky, you can hear the chirping of crickets, birds are calling, trees are whispering in the breeze. And this boy is immersed in this exquisite beauty, and he's struck by a deep feeling of awe and a sense of belonging and a feeling of love for this meadow. And this moment is a moment that goes on to shape the rest of his life. In this meadow, he instinctively knows that whatever protects this meadow and its natural cycles is good, and whatever damages this meadow's natural cycles is not good. Now, this moment in the meadow that we've visited in our imagination is in fact a memory that Thomas Berry recalls in his book, The Great Work. And this is the book in which he articulates many of the founding ideas of Earth jurisprudence. I imagine that many of us can think of a place in nature that has made a deep impression, a place that we have felt awe about, wonder, perhaps even love for that particular ecosystem, and a place about which we would instinctively feel in our hearts that whatever protects this ecosystem is good, and whatever undermines this ecosystem is not. And I share this story because I think it really captures something of the essence of Earth jurisprudence. So it conveys this ethic of respect, of reverence for the natural cycles of all life. And I think this ethic is one that feels instinctively right to many of us, but it's an ethic that has been marginalized in dominant Western culture where a very different logic prevails. So if we look to the dominant industrial growth paradigm, we see that it's founded on a belief that the earth is not a source of reverence, but rather of resources, that the earth is composed of commodities rather than communities, that our ecosystems are the property of human beings, a collection of objects or dead matter to be exploited and extracted from in service to our economy. And this paradigm really centers the human, and it's blind to the intrinsic value of the wider web of life, of which humans are just a small part. So for those of you unfamiliar with Thomas Berry, he's the father of Earth jurisprudence. He was a cultural historian, a former Passionist monk, and a real visionary. And over the course of his long life, he looked very deeply into the human-earth relationship across cultures and across time. And he sought to situate the human story within the wider context of the story of the universe. So he was really trying to reignite a consciousness of belonging to an immense and mysterious cosmos, this sense of the earth and the universe as sacred and alive, just as they have understood to be in the cosmologies of many indigenous communities. And Thomas and his writings have been a huge inspiration for the Gaia Foundation, and so many others, so Michelle and Margaret amongst them, I'm sure. And he understood that there's a very dangerous delusion that shapes dominant worldviews, this delusion that humans are separate from and superior to nature and can therefore extract from life endlessly and without consequence. But of course, we're now living the consequences of this flawed assumption as we face the chaos of multiple interconnected crises. And although we've had decades of environmental legislation, we're careering towards climate and biodiversity collapse and imperiling most life on the planet in the process. And in fact, our legal systems are effectively legitimizing and facilitating systemic destruction and exploitation of the earth. And this is in part because our laws are objectifying non-human nature as property and resources for humans to do as we will with. And, you know, of course, environmental laws, they curtail the odd freedom here or there, but mostly our laws are licensing and legitimizing the unraveling of the fabric of life. So Albert Einstein, he said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that created them in the first place. And ultimately, Earth jurisprudence is calling for a transformation in our ways of thinking and how we understand our place on Earth and in the universe. So Thomas Berry famously said, the universe is not a collection of objects, but it's a communion of subjects. And Earth jurisprudence is really based on an understanding that the well-being of the Earth as a whole is primary. And of course, the life and well-being of all other members of the Earth community flow from this foundation. So it's really planetary health rather than the interests of humans that are centered in Earth jurisprudence. So essentially, it's calling for a transformation towards Earth-centered ways of seeing and being in the world. And this is based on an understanding that humans are one species amongst so many others in an interdependent web of life. And of course, this recognition is a source of awe, it's a source of wonder, but also of responsibility to the wider Earth community. And I think from this perspective, recognition of the rights of nature is not a far stretch. Of course, in an interdependent web of life, why would humans alone be rights bearing? It doesn't make sense. So the great work that Thomas references in his title here, the great work that he foresaw for the 21st century is this transition from a relationship of exploitation with the natural world towards a mutually enhancing and respectful human-Earth relationship in which the inherent value and the intrinsic rights of each member of the Earth community are recognized, and that's irrespective of how useful or otherwise we deem those beings to be. And I should say, Thomas Berry, he wasn't entirely happy with the language of rights, but he recognized that this is the language of our modern legal systems, and that recognition of the rights could be a stepping stone towards deeper transformation in the relationship between humans and the wider ecologies in which they're embedded. So he advocated for recognition of the rights of the natural world, but he was very clear, it's not for humans to give or grant these rights to nature. These rights are intrinsic. They come about by virtue of existence, just as human rights do. So they're not equivalent to human rights. These rights are kind of species or role specific. So given all of this talk about rights and jurisprudence, Earth jurisprudence is often described as a legal philosophy. But at the Gaia Foundation, we understand it more as a kind of a way of being in the world. So essentially about practicing a way of life that is aligned with Earth's natural life-sustaining cycles and rhythms, and co-creating human governance systems that are in harmony with the ecosystems in which they are embedded. So it's about living with this consciousness that humans are a small part of a much greater whole, and that we have a responsibility to live within ecological boundaries and to support rather than undermine the integrity and health of the ecosystems upon which we depend. And this is really the Earth part of Earth jurisprudence, that living with this kind of Earth-centered consciousness. And the jurisprudence part speaks to this question of governance. So from this Earth-centered consciousness, how do we as humans organize ourselves as communities? What laws do we live by? What's our ethical framework? And of course, from these questions, more questions flow, including around law. So how do we determine what our laws are? And I think it's clear by this point that Earth jurisprudence is inviting us to step outside of and to critically assess our Western legal systems. So what are these legal systems really in service to? I mean, I would answer to corporate interests, to shareholder profits. These legal systems are not in service to thriving biodiverse life on the planet, but rather the accumulation of wealth for a small minority of humans. So Earth jurisprudence, I would say, is an invitation to decolonize our understanding of law, to think beyond the black letter law of statutes and court judgments, and to really interrogate the very foundations of our understanding of law. And when Thomas Berry was developing his ideas around a new jurisprudence, which he later named as Earth jurisprudence, he looked to two sources. So he looked to the natural world, and he looked to indigenous governance systems. And from an Earth jurisprudence perspective, and from the perspective of many indigenous communities, the Earth herself is understood as the primary source of law. So the law is in the land. What does this mean? Well, indigenous communities don't look to constitutions or court judgments to find their law. Instead, the law has been discerned through generations and generations of acute observation of and relationship with the ecosystems in which a community is embedded. So it's through this intimate relationship with the land that communities are understanding their place within the wider whole, and therefore how they should govern themselves in such a way as to maintain the integrity and health of the whole, which of course in turn safeguards the health of the community. So Earth Jurisprudence was conceived by Thomas Berry at the turn of this century, but he was clear, although it's a new term, this is not a new way of seeing the world. In fact, for most of human history, humans have seen life from this earth-centered perspective, and the embers of this way of seeing and being in the world are still alive today among indigenous and traditional communities who continue to derive their ethics and their customary laws from the natural world. So, moving on from that introduction, Earth Jurisprudence is really, it's the guiding star by which we navigate at the Gaia Foundation. It's been the philosophy that has underpinned our work since the late 1990s. And we've been working with Indigenous communities in the revival of their governance systems for over 3 decades now. And in fact, this year we're celebrating our 35th year anniversary. So in our early years, we partnered with communities in the Colombian and Brazilian Amazon, but over the past 2 decades, the Earth Jurisprudence Programme has been working primarily with partners and communities in Africa. And around a decade or so ago, we began offering a 3-year training programme for Earth Jurisprudence practitioners, and graduates of those trainings are based in East, West and Southern Africa. And along with graduates of the trainings, the Gaia Foundation and partners in Africa are members of the African Earth Jurisprudence Collective. And this is a community of practice which is dedicated to rekindling earth-centered life ways on the continent. And the roots of this work stretch back to 1996. So Gaia's founders, Liz Hoskin and Ed Posey, first met Thomas Berry in 1996, and his vision of Earth Jurisprudence deeply resonated with the work that was happening in the Amazon. So after this initial meeting, many other discussions and gatherings followed, and Gaia worked closely with Thomas Berry in the last decade of his life, and he was really encouraging the Gaia Foundation to kind of continue with this work of reviving Indigenous governance systems, very much as examples of Earth Jurisprudence in practice. So since 1996, the Gaia Foundation has been involved with a whole host of Earth Jurisprudence initiatives, and there's not really the time today to share that history, but there's a timeline I can share in the chat. But among the many initiatives, there were exchanges between communities in the Colombian Amazon and community leaders in several countries in Africa. And these exchanges were centered around exploring how communities whose cultures have been shattered by colonialism can come together again and can reawaken the memory of traditional knowledge and life ways. And the Amazonian communities were further along in this journey. So they were sharing stories of how they had revived their Indigenous governance systems and reclaimed their ancestral territories, and were catalyzing, by sharing these stories, catalyzed similar initiatives in several countries in Africa, and this real growing enthusiasm for reviving Africa's customary governance systems. And I think the customary laws of Africa offer us an example of Earth Jurisprudence in practice. And of course, Earth Jurisprudence, it finds diverse expression in different contexts. It's very much going to be shaped by the specifics of the culture and the ecosystem in which it emerges. And that's absolutely how it should be. I think we should embrace this diversity. There's no definitive answer as to what Earth Jurisprudence in practice looks like. But today, let's go deeper into how Earth Jurisprudence is taking root in some communities in Africa, accompanied by members of the African Earth Jurisprudence Collective. And at this point, I'd really like to weave in some other voices, so the voices of some of my colleagues. So I'd like to share a 6-minute film about the trainings for Earth Jurisprudence practitioners that Gaia co-facilitates with others, including the Siama program in South Africa. And I hope this will give a sense of the trainings, but also of the work with communities that graduates go on to do following the trainings. So I'm going to, at this point, share my screen.
Is it moving, folks?
It's moving, yeah.
Earth Jurisprudence is a philosophy which comes from understanding that there is an order that's inherent from the day life began. For example, when the sun rises and the moon rises, and when plants shed off leaves and put on leaves. These are all rhythms and patterns that are embedded in nature.
Since 2014, the Gaia Foundation has run a transformational training course for emerging African leaders. The course prepares them to become Earth Jurisprudence practitioners.
We're now living at a time of multiple crises. We have ecosystem collapsing, we have huge mass extinctions, climate change. And so this course is really to create a context for people who are deeply concerned about the state of the world. It's really looking for African-rooted pathways out of this mess. And the inspiration comes very much from understanding indigenous knowledge systems and how different cultures have lived on this continent for generations without destroying the very foundations of life.
Through wilderness experience, observation of inner and outer nature, and journeying back to roots with their own communities, the course supports participants to rediscover their place in the web of life.
Every morning I walk from my house barefoot to the river, which is not very near, and I spend my time there reflecting and observing the behavior of water. This has been one of my practice in trying to connect with the story of the river and the natural happenings of the river. There has been a transformation inside me. It helps me to connect with the ancestors and the community of those who are yet to be born and the community of those who are living.
The first group of Earth Jurisprudence practitioners graduated from the course in 2017. These graduates are now mentoring the next group of practitioners in training, sharing the experiences of personal transformation and working with communities across sub-Saharan Africa.
It has made me connect more with the elders so that I find different knowledge around how to revive different rituals for the first fruits, for example, and for the rain-making ceremony.
I did not know what I needed to do in order to make a difference, and when Earth Jurisprudence came on board, I completely knew exactly what I was missing.
These African Earth Jurisprudence practitioners are now accompanying communities on a journey to regenerate their Earth-centered traditions, restore damaged ecosystems, and build their resilience to climate change.
I have seen a lot of impact in terms of revival of the traditional knowledge, revival of our traditional scene and also food, our traditional medicine.
The communities were afraid, could not talk about themselves, for example, as custodians of sacred natural sites. They thought that was a tradition that is backward, but now they have formed an association as custodians of sacred natural sites. They are engaging government for recognition of their traditions and cultures.
The EJ work with Pikita communities has really led to the revival of millet and more drought-tolerant crops and seeds. When the millet came back, we started to see certain changes happening in the broader ecosystem. And we started to see certain bird species that we had last seen years back.
J'ai contribué aussi à amener d'autres à cette prise de conscience, à amener d'autres à connaître jurisprudence de la terre. Et maintenant, à enseigner aux autres le respect des lois de la nature. c'est en ça que ma contribution est capitale pour le changement de paradigme.
From Benin to Zimbabwe, Kenya to the Congo, together practitioners and communities are building an earth jurisprudence movement that is reviving the ecological and cultural diversity that is Africa's heritage and her future.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, and apologies for technical difficulties there. But I really wanted to bring in some other voices. The video was a little bit jumpy for me, but I hope everyone was able to follow. So yeah, as you'll have had a sense from the film, Earth jurisprudence is emerging through the revival of traditional cultures, traditional ecological knowledge, the restoration of sacred natural sites, and the revitalization of customary laws. And these customary laws are the original pre-colonial laws of Africa. So they're not created by humans in isolation, but they're born of this deep relationship between humans and their ancestral territories. And, you know, we can contrast this with Western legal systems that are decoupled from ecological realities. These customary laws, they're oral traditionally, they're passed down from generation to generation. They come in the form of story and ritual, custom, taboo. And from the perspective of these communities, the earth is understood to be sacred, to be alive, to be imbued with spirit, and humans are understood as participants in this wider community of life. Sacred natural sites, which were mentioned in the film, these are natural features within ancestral territories, and they are of great ecological, cultural and spiritual significance to communities. So they're sort of particularly potent places where rituals are undertaken by custodians of sacred natural sites, and this is done to maintain the health and integrity of the wider ecosystem and the communities as well. But these laws, they're not rights-based. They don't use the language of rights. Rights are, of course, a Western legal concept. But there's more of a focus on relationships and responsibilities. So the laws are governing the relationship between the human communities and the ecosystems to which they belong. And yeah, that's a key distinction. They're governing the human communities rather than managing the ecosystems. These customary laws are effectively governing those communities to live in respectful relationship with the wider ecosystem. So they will govern how a human community relates to their sacred natural sites, how a community fishes and hunts, and the context in which they would refrain from hunting and fishing, how a community farms, where they refrain from farming or grazing, how a community saves seeds, how they exchange seeds. Seeds are considered to be sacred, they're not bought and sold traditionally. How a community conducts their spiritual lives, which are centered around sacred natural sites. And also these laws will govern the mechanisms for restorative justice as well, and rituals that are done to restore equilibrium when there has been a violation of the laws. And in terms of the wider legal context, the African Earth Jurisprudence Collective is accompanying communities within plurilegal contexts. So African states have state law that has grown out of colonial legal systems, and the constitutions will tend to recognize customary laws to a certain degree, so to the extent that the laws are not in contravention to the constitution. So customary laws are recognized but effectively subordinate to state laws. And of course, the worldviews of these two legal systems are fundamentally in conflict, with the state law kind of predominantly seeing the natural world as a collection of objects, and the customary law perceiving the earth as a communion of subjects. So it can be challenging, as you would imagine, to reconcile these two legal systems. Part of the work of the collective, though, is to create space within the state system for recognition of the ecological wisdom of customary laws, and to do so at local, national and regional level. And over the years, there have been some legal triumphs, which I'll just mention in brief. So There's a Sacred Forest Act that was enacted in Benin in 2012, and this recognises sacred forests as protected areas and the dwelling places of ancestors, and provides for communities to protect and govern these sacred forests. And then in 2017, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights passed a resolution 372, which calls on state parties to recognise sacred natural sites in their customary governance systems. You may be familiar with this. In 2019, Uganda became the first African country to recognise the rights of nature within national state law. And then in 2021, Bulisa district in Western Uganda has passed a bill for an ordinance at district level recognising the customary laws of the Bugungu people in connection with the protection of their sacred natural sites. And this draft legislation is now under final review with the Attorney General. So there's a journal article which I can share which has some more details on those legal precedents. But for the collective, law and policy can be a great support, but the prime focus of our work is working with communities and supporting the conditions for strong custodians and elders in particular to come forward and to really uphold the law so that it's alive, it's a living law within the community, so that it's being upheld, so that the communities are actively engaging with their sacred natural sites, ecological farming is revived, knowledge and stories and laws are being passed down between the generations. So it's really about kind of revitalizing that relationship between the community and their territories. But of course, this work, it takes time. Customary laws have been severely undermined through colonization, and it takes time for communities to come together and to bring back the knowledge of their ecological governance systems, often many years of community dialogues. And yeah, the revival is very holistic. So communities will often begin with the recovery of indigenous seed, but of course, all aspects of community life are interconnected, and the recovery of seed will then lead to other aspects of revival. And there's an animation which I think, given it was a bit difficult sharing the last film, I'll share a link maybe people can look at later. There are a few animations that we've released which tell the story of some of the graduates and their work with community, and so I'll share a link to one of those animations which shows how the revival of millet, a traditional seed, has rippled out and brought wider transformation within communities in Bakita in Zimbabwe. But now to come to a close, yeah, I wanted to share just a reflection from Jules Cashford, who is one of the Gaia Foundation's trustees, and in an essay on Earth jurisprudence in this book, Exploring Wild Law, she writes, law is necessary where morality has failed, and morality is necessary where love has failed. So I'll say that once more. Law is necessary where morality has failed, and morality is necessary where love has failed. And I think this brings us back to Thomas's meadow and how, yeah, really we begin with love. A lot of our Earth jurisprudence work and our wider work at the Gaia Foundation is ultimately about restoring the human-Earth relationship to one which is characterized by love, by intimacy, and by an embodied sense of our interdependence with the wider web of life. And I think from this basis, an ethical framework and ecocentric laws arise, but the foundation is really those qualities in the relationship between humans and their wider ecosystems. And as our indigenous colleagues in the Colombian Amazon would say, you know, ultimately the law is written in the heart. So ultimately the vision of Earth jurisprudence is, I think, that we fall back in love with the earth, and from this foundation we can transition towards a more generative relationship with the wider Earth community. So yeah, thank you for listening and for gathering today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Margaret and Michelle and continuing this discussion.
Thank you so much, Carlotta. Absolutely lovely to hear the work that you're all doing in Africa, particularly. And we will have questions, folks, but what I might do is go to Margaret now and invite her to share with us. It's interesting, I'm trying, normally I can find people quickly, but oh, there you are. I was trying to click on you to spotlight you, and you are not being apparent. Okay, there we go. So thank you so much, Carlotta. I will turn the spotlight off you so you can relax in your lovely garden. And Margaret, so nice to see you and to have you live. I'm not even sure I want to ask what time it is, but thank you for joining us, and over to you to share with us about your work.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, it's not too bad. It's slightly earlier than I would have been awake otherwise. So, but She-Hulk drops at 3 a.m. So I got to watch that right before our webinar here. Exactly. Now I can talk with the people on the West Coast about it in real time. But hello and good day to everyone. I'm going to try and talk and do technical things at the same time, which usually doesn't go well. Okay, perfect. Well, again, good day to everyone, and thank you so much for having me here to share our experience at the center with applying these Earth jurisprudence principles in practice. I'll get more into the center and what we do, but when we were founded in 2006, a lot of the work was purely theoretical. It was developing this area of the law, and to see it starting to come to fruition now and seeing that life cycle of this area of the law has been very exciting. But as our wonderful host shared with you, my name is Margaret Stewart. I am currently a visiting professor of law at Barry University School of Law in Orlando, Florida, in the United States. So think Disney, they're right down the road. I am currently also the director of our in-house environmental and earth law clinic. I serve on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, or GARN, and I currently facilitate the legal hub of GARN. So if you find yourself super interested in the things that we're talking about today from the legal perspective, do be sure to connect, and we can see if we can work together under that umbrella. But I am also the director of the Center for Earth Jurisprudence at Barry Law. And at the center, we advocate for laws, policies, and governance systems that are aimed to legally protect the sustainability of life and health on Earth. And as a team of lawyers, we believe that the best way of doing this is by rethinking our legal framework in a way that takes us to a more earth-centered perspective. So today I'm just going to very briefly introduce how this legal philosophy has started to take shape in recent years, specifically in the areas that we've been working on, and how we're preparing the next generation of legal advocates to continue its development in legal systems throughout the world. So Thomas Berry said that there are two things needed to guide our judgment for the challenges ahead: a certain alarm at what is happening at present, and a fascination with the future available to us, if only if we respond creatively to the urgencies of the present. So we take statements like this, and we apply it to our current situation, and it requires us to ask, how do we address the missing pieces in our legal system? Because what we find is that even when these robust and comprehensive approaches of environmental protection, even when they work perfectly, we're still seeing a lapse in, the intention of environmental protection and the reality of that. So there's a disconnect somewhere, and that's where the critical and constructive components of Earth jurisprudence can be very helpful in allowing us to critique, what we are working with currently, and then propose alternative solutions. So the simple question of, what is Earth jurisprudence, or as it's now shifting into from the legal aspect, Earth law, because it is becoming an area of practice. How do we define that? Well, a recent definition has defined it as such. It says the emerging body of law for protecting, restoring, and stabilizing the functional interdependency of Earth's life and life support systems at the local, bioregional, national, and global levels. Earth law may be expressed in constitutional, statutory, common law, and customary law, as well as treaties and other agreements in both public and private. So it has two main elements. It's this new context of Earth law as transformed environmental law, but then also this departure from environmental law. So the Earth jurisprudence legal framework, it provides a mechanism for humans to live within our planetary boundaries, to prospectively care for our ecosystem, to preserve biodiversity, to restore damaged ecosystems and loss of biodiversity, and to protect human environmental rights and human customary rights, and to justly share in the burdens of mitigating and adapting to climate change and other environmental stressors. Because laws are essentially to regulate human behavior, right? Because our non-human members of the Earth community don't understand the laws that we draft. So this reminds us that we need to have this greater consistency between our regulations and what is being regulated, okay? And to have a more cohesive relationship, not one that is necessarily built on human dominion and, kind of forcing the ecosystem into a box that works best for humans. That is what we've been doing, and we can see that that is not working. So there are some foundational understandings of Earth jurisprudence, and I won't read these all off to you, but just to focus on a couple of them, that the Earth is precious, that it's composed of these interdependently functioning systems, that it exists contingently, and that it is subject to irreversible harm to its life-sustaining capacities, that it is currently in a human-caused ecological crisis, that our conventional Western laws, including our approach to environmental law, is contributing to this crisis, and that reform has to be based on an ecocentric approach. This way. So in his book, The Rights of Nature, A Legal Revolution That Could Save the World, David Boyd shares with us the Earth Covenant. This was drafted by a Canadian Indigenous lawyer and artist, Terry Lynn Williams Davidson, and it discusses the responsibilities that humans have towards the Earth. So they include respecting that we're all part of an interconnected world, conserving and restoring the Earth and the species and cultures that she nurtures, managing our use of the Earth in ways that maintain her cycles and interrelationships and do not exceed the planetary limits, and respecting future generations. She also explains how cultural views like seeing the Earth community in a more familial, interconnected way changes our behavior towards them. And Boyd goes on to explain that there's no doubt, this is a direct quote, that there is no doubt that seeing cedar trees as sisters instead of natural resources dramatically changes human attitudes toward and use of forests. So we can see how these concepts are at odds with our current structure that puts human beings at the top, holding dominion and control over all else, and the real structure where humans are part of a vast interconnected relationship with the entire Earth community. So Earth jurisprudence from a legal perspective is how we incorporate these conceptual foundations into the practical laws that will help us accomplish these goals. And that shift that we talked about from the conceptual nature of Earth jurisprudence to the practical applications is essentially answering that question, how? How do we do that? So we actually have a variety of legal strategies that have been used globally to incorporate Earth jurisprudence into our current legal systems. And we just have a couple of them here. We have the application of the public trust doctrine and the emerging area of atmospheric trust litigation. We have the recognition of the rights of future generations, the recognition of the rights of nature, co-violations, the intersection of human environmental rights and the rights of nature, non-human rights, the growing support for the crime of ecocide, indigenous legalities that support these conceptual foundations that we've been talking about, a general ecosystem, ecocentric environmental governance, and we have a series of other global and local strategies at our disposal. So that next question of how do we incorporate these conceptual ideas into a legal system that tends to be at odds with it, we do currently have some strategies to employ as this area of the law develops and as that cultural paradigm shift that is necessary to support those type of developments continues to happen. And it's being in the position of teaching these concepts to law students, I will say it has been very encouraging over the course of my career that when I started, I would have to spend a pretty significant amount of time at the introduction of these concepts, making them sound reasonable and sound like something that was possible. And that time spent in the courses has shrunken significantly. Once, this concept is introduced, we can see that paradigm shift happening because the students that are coming up can see the possibilities in this. And it doesn't seem like such a, out there kind of concept, that it is something that could be a viable solution to the problems that we're having. So that paradigm shift, from my own small perspective in my little corner of Florida, I can definitely see happening, which has been very encouraging. So to focus on the work that we've done in the United States, one of the most popular applications here has been the recognition of the rights of nature. Okay, where I'm located in the state of Florida, this has been the most commonly used strategy, and we are currently in a couple different legal battles with the state to see this come to fruition. But this has been, of those strategies that we have to work with, the one that seems to be the most popular under the US legal system. This and the application of the public trust doctrine seem to be the two most popular. So as we look at how we can incorporate these concepts into the legal system, we need to start with not only, what the rights of nature are, but also what they're not. it's important to understand that the rights of nature are not something that we are granting to the non-human members of our Earth community. Much like we possess human rights simply by virtue of being human, so do all other members of this vast interconnected Earth community that we have. We don't have to do anything to obtain our human rights. They are intrinsic and inherent in us as human beings. And our laws are codified to simply recognize those rights. They're not granting them. So why we focus on the legal structure, why we see this need for this agreed upon systemic worldview. If we use the analogy of human rights, we know that our human rights are constantly under attack. It's not something that is immune from violation. And when they're violated, we need somewhere we can go to obtain recourse for that violation. The same goes for the intrinsic rights of nature. However, currently, there is not a legal framework in place that allows for that recourse. And we have to look at what that lack of recourse results in. We're seeing it now, right? We're currently in the new geological age known as the Anthropocene. It's defined solely by the negative impacts that human beings have had on our Mother Earth and the increased degradation that has resulted from that. We're in the sixth mass extinction. Again, something unlike all previous extinction events, it's been completely caused by the behavior of one species. So, this incredible and frankly horrifying uptick in species extinction that we've noticed since the Industrial Revolution shows that, even with the advent of the modern environmental law period in the 1970s, that hasn't been addressed adequately. So we go back to those critical and constructive approaches of Earth jurisprudence, what we could critique the current system, and we offer up potential solutions to that. Which then brings us to the very common question of, why not just pass another law? Why not just pass a law for environmental protection? Well, the question, the answer to that is ultimately the foundation on which we have built our environmental regulatory law system is flawed. And thus, any of the laws that we build upon that are going to continue to be built on shaky ground, and they're never going to quite address the systemic problems. And what we need is large-scale systems change. Christopher Stone, the author of Should Trees Have Standing, one of the seminal written works in this field, explained the problem with what he calls the rights paradox. And it's quoted here. It says, "There is something of a seamless web involved. There will be resistance to giving the thing rights until it can be seen and valued for itself. Yet it is hard to see it and value it for itself until we can bring ourselves to give it rights, which is almost inevitably going to sound inconceivable to a large group of people." And this paradox helps explain why circumventing the core issues with simply, upping the requirements for a consumptive use water permit or allowing a contained animal feeding operation in a particular region, they're just not going to cut it. The way the regulations are working is what's led to the current ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. So we have to take a more holistic, more ecologically intelligent approach to our legal organization of our relationship with the Earth community. And to do that, we have to advocate for that large scale systems change. So we need to have what Thomas Berry referred to as the mutually enhancing relationship with the Earth community that we already talked about earlier today. He poignantly explained that we cannot have well humans on a sick planet. We cannot have a viable human economy by destroying the Earth economy. In other words, we need to move the basic referring from the human, from the human to this larger context of things. So at the Center for Earth Jurisprudence, we put these theoretical concepts into practice in a couple different ways. We do it directly by supporting legal cases that advocate for things like the rights of nature, the expansion of the public trust doctrine, and non-human rights. We work not only to expands the larger applications of Earth jurisprudence on a global and national level and state level, but we also work closely with local governments to address issues of environmental injustices and inequities that arise from our current approach to environmental protection. So projects that increase the resiliency of vulnerable communities to natural disasters is a more local but equally important application of Earth jurisprudence in practice. We work with vulnerable communities in Central Florida to address the historical and systemic underrepresentation as it pertains to things like climate change adaptation and mitigation. And we work with the state to advocate for greater protections, be it, for the human right to a healthy environment or the rights of nature in and of themselves. And we support those local efforts and those state efforts to recognize the inherent rights of our non-human members of the Earth community. Indirectly, we really have what we believe is the most privileged position, is that it allows us to help prepare that next generation of Earth jurisprudence advocates. In the center and in the Environmental and Earth Law Clinic, we're able to bring the students along with us in our work. So just looking at the time, I always have to really watch my time because I will talk and talk forever. So looking at my time, I'm exactly at 20 minutes right now. So I think I might stop there and explain more as we turn to the questions. But thank you so much for, again, having me today. And please connect with us at the center through the methods that we have on our screen. We have a website where you can sign up for our mailing list. And we have all the socials at Earth Jurist, and that is my email there. So thank you again. I will take this screen down and turn it back to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's quite the luxury for me, given Ayla has been informed by Earth Jurisprudence, to hear your work and Carlotta's. It's almost strange hearing other folks explaining what Earth Jurisprudence is, given I feel like I've spent 10 years doing it. So yes, thank you so much. And it's kind of unusual for me to both speak and facilitate. So I apologize if that seems a little weird, but I am, for the sake of our discussion, with great enthusiasm, going to tell you a little bit about the work that Ayla does in response to the call of the great work and Earth Jurisprudence. So I was going to say, sit back and relax, Margaret, or in your case, try to stay awake, given how early you've gotten up. Thank you. All right, folks. So I'm going to tell you about what we've been up to in Australia. And to do that, I also want to acknowledge I've got a number of my Earth Laws team on here with me. We've got Christina Myers, and I can see James Lee, and I think there's some other folks on here. Yeah, so it's not just the Michelle Maloney show. Yeah, there's lots of us here. Oh, and I can see Ian Lowe there too. Hello, Ian. Hello, everybody. All right, so let me Oh, I'm always opening up the wrong things, aren't I? I'm a legend. Here we go. All right, here comes the Aussie version of what we've been up to. What a luxury to tell you about all of this. So, Earth Jurisprudence and the work of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. I hope you can see the slides. Yeah, all good? Yep, thank you. So, I want to start with a personal story. I came across Earth Jurisprudence in, I think it was about 2009. And prior to that, I'd spent, even at that stage, 20 years working on environmental law, sustainability, very early days of climate change responses. And I always felt that the problems we were facing were this giant, unravelable ball of messiness. And what Earth Jurisprudence helped me do personally was provide a Western critique back at the Western problems that we had created. And I've always felt, and I've often used this slide as this sort of giant, messy, where do we start? How do we understand what's going on in the world at the moment? How do we understand the ecological crisis? So for me, when I came across Earth Laws and this book, the great work, the bits that stuck out to me was Thomas Berry's excellent analysis of the problematic, the underpinning structures of industrialized society. As I say in my talks, Berry looked at all four of the fundamental establishments that control human affairs and analysed them, saying that they were anthropocentric, and in his writings, looking at these efforts to create a wonder world, creating a waste world instead. And I've simplified his analysis with this slide. I wheel it out a lot, but the idea that our law and government, our economics, our universities, and I translate that more broadly to education and religion, these underpinning structures are all human-centered and have created this deep separation. I always talk about how Berry and many others identify anthropocentrism as this profound disconnect. And then, as he says in that quote, the deepest cause of the present devastation is found in a mode of consciousness that has established a radical discontinuity between human and other modes of being. And I won't talk too much about anthropocentrism. I think Carlotta and Margaret have given a really beautiful introduction to these deeper ideas within Earth Jurisprudence and Thomas Berry's work. One thing I love is this idea throughout his work of right-sizing the scale of the human presence on Earth. And that obviously connects with a lot of the economic work that we do around degrowth and other concepts, which I'll come back to. But in terms of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, I think what's important for us is Earth Jurisprudence is the one branch of the tree of concepts that we are informed by and that our work is created to achieve. This idea of Westerners critiquing their own Western industrialized system is very important. But living here in Australia, one of the most powerful connecting points to country is, the world's oldest continuous culture, the First Peoples of Australia, and the work that we do with our friends and colleagues from the cultural backgrounds of First Peoples in Australia has personally been hugely inspirational and a lifelong journey of learning and unlearning. So Ayla's inspiration is both Earth Jurisprudence, but very much uniquely Australian. We started very much with a focus on law, and I'll talk in a moment about the different elements of our work. But right from the beginning, within the first few months of forming up 10 years ago now, we realized that you can't just talk about law, particularly in the Australian context when we have such a formal and very well-created, stable legal system. Making that kind of change is a little different to some other countries and places. But at the end of the day, the systems change, this idea of shifting our governance systems from human-centered to an earth-centered way of being is everything that Ayla is about. And it's certainly the core elements of Earth Jurisprudence to us that we talk about and focus on. But there are elements within this systems change work. So I'm going to very quickly talk you through, and I'm sorry if it's a bit of a rapid fire, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about these chunks of our work. but then weave them back together at the end, particularly with the Green Prince program. So we have different siloed elements of our work, because the audiences we've found, you know, to talk to lawyers about science is one thing, to talk to economists about something, you know, we find embracing legal aspects into the legal profession and law students has a really good effect. And then there are other times when we want to be multidisciplinary. So if we talk for a moment about law, certainly, and this dodgy little diagram is mine, I can take credit for the ugly ones. All the beautiful ones are probably created by James. I use this umbrella now to, particularly to explain to folks in non-legal professions, actually, that Earth Laws has come to be this wonderful collection of ideas. And on this side, we've got Earth Jurisprudence, eco side, ecological law, the work that Jeff Garver and others are doing, particularly connected to ecozoic law for the ecozoic, rights of nature, and all of the different things that have bubbled up in the last 15 years around different concepts of that. I mean, as most of you know, you could give a 3-hour talk or workshop on rights of nature, just delving into all of the different branches that are coming up in these ideas. But again, in Australia, a really important part of our work when we talk about Earth jurisprudence, connecting to country, learning from the earth, Aboriginal people have their own set of laws previous to colonisation in 1788. Recently, people are referring to them more and more as the first laws, because they are both in terms of chronology, but also first laws are the laws of the land. And it's that simple, and that's a bioregional focus. And I'll talk in a moment about the work that we do with Mary Graham and others, using the Indigenous relationist ethos as a core of a lot of the work that we're doing. And I think Carlotta touched on this, Aboriginal people, like other Indigenous folks around the world, don't talk about rights. They talk about obligations and duties, but particularly the law of obligation. And all of these things bubble up under our umbrella. That's a very mixed metaphor. Sit under our umbrella of thinking about Earth laws. Oh, where am I? So the other big chunk of our work, like I said, from early days, because I've worked with Indigenous mates since my early 20s and have been profoundly informed by the work that they do to care for country and to continue their ongoing culture and traditions despite the horrors and disruption of colonisation. So one thing that Ayla has done, and I'm still really proud of this, is we actually created a separate entity to build our Indigenous and non-Indigenous partnerships projects. It feels like the proper way to actually have an Indigenous-led process that we're connected to and part of. So Future Dreaming Australia, myself, Mary Graham, Ross Williams, and now James Lee are the directors of this separate entity, because that gives it its own voice for sharing ecological knowledge across cultures. And Future Dreaming is also supporting Regenerative Songlines Australia, which is becoming a really important space for different Indigenous elders to come together and share information and updates. We had a session and discussion just on Monday night, and there's other stuff on that website. And this is not a very clear photo, but it's a photo of Mary Graham, who I think is one of the most important thinkers and philosophers in Australia, and the work that she does on the relationist ethos and sharing with people a very different logic and structure for governance. It's really important work, and most people who come across her work are changed by it. I'm honoured to be working on a book with her where we're exploring what Australian society would look like if it was built on the relationist ethos. And it's a brilliant way to bring all of her work together in the first part of the book. And then we're basically playing with normative and wonderful ideas in the second part of the book. I don't have time to go through this, but I always wax lyrical about the wonderful Mary Graham. Economics. Now, in Thomas Berry's work, you know, and so just a reminder, I'm talking about how Ayla is responding to the great work and taking up that call and challenging the current economic system as one chunk of the big systems change issues. And perhaps I should take a step back. When I hear Carlotta talk about the work that they do in Africa, it's really interesting for me to compare and contrast what we get up to in Australia. where Carlotta and their work in the African network is enabling folks to reconnect, and they're using the Earth Jurisprudence approach for cultural traditions. I think in Australia, what we've been doing is really using Earth Jurisprudence as a call to non-Indigenous people to really start to challenge their own systems and connect. And then as part of that journey, connect non-Indigenous people to Indigenous knowledge systems that are already very much vibrant and alive and doing amazing things in this continent. And so that's why economics is important, because we're talking to Aussies, you know, many folks from industrialized society about the economic system. And when we unpack it, it's extremely empowering. And when we think about changing an economic system to an earth-centered way, it's absolutely fantastic. Challenging growth economics. And we auspiced the New Economy Network Australia. Again, it's been very targeted and strategic to try to get people to think about an earth-centered economy. We found that if you, as AILA, invited people to come to a session, we would have one particular audience. But as we built the New Economy Network, we've been able to expand it to many more thousands of people who are focused on economic issues, focused on the day-to-day of running businesses, and slowly integrating some pretty fantastic ideas and initiatives. And I won't talk too much about it because I don't have time, but again, if folks are listening to this who aren't already familiar with the work that Ayla and Nina and Future Dreaming do, please look us up. It's a very exciting place. There's so many great people in it. And one thing I did want to say is, again, we always try to make sure that any of the ideas that we look at from other places, we make sure that we Aussiefy them, including donor economics. And so you'll find here these wonderful ideas from Kate Raworth and others linking planetary boundaries to social justice. But they have like the safe and just space for humanity. And of course, for me, the first thing I thought of was, well, we need a living space for the whole Earth community. So I got James Lee to do this diagram. This is the Ayla Greenprints version of the donut. Because although we think we have social foundations, those foundations need their bioregional foundation and caring for country and all of the plants and animals and creatures. So this is the way that we're kind of like a bridge between cool ideas and which bits and pieces are useful in Australia and which aren't, always deferring to the Indigenous knowledge systems that are already here, and where we need them, gathering our own thoughts and ideas and programs and activities and connecting with all the good stuff. I don't have much time to go through the arts, but we have a really beautiful arts program. It's not as large and extensive as I'd love. If I have time at the end, I might jump to the website. We've eartharts.org.au, and right now we're just building our latest gallery with our Earth Arts Collective. But we believe inside Ayla that the human spirit and creativity is deeply important, not only to being human and to having a beautiful life and to connecting with the living world with great love, but also in articulating change. We can't change, and that classic quote from Einstein, you know, we can't solve problems with the same thinking that created them. We have to have a different way of thinking and feeling and doing. So it's something that's really important to me personally, is we've always woven fun, imagination, creativity throughout the work we do in Ayla. And you'll see that just from our various websites in terms of the beautiful photos and images that we use. So that's the website. I didn't have time. In terms of the systems change work, so it's all well and good to look across law and to look across economics, and these are deeply, deeply powerful structures in industrialized societies. So it's very much worth our while to address them. And I should have said that, you know, through the law, we've been exploring what rights of nature and laws of obligation can look like in Australia, challenging the concretized colonial legal system and what it should look like. But when we bring it all together, when we really want to do systems change, it's an interconnection of all those ideas. And Greenprints is kind of our a spearhead program put together about 5 years ago. I dreamt up a number of different aspects to it, where we wanted to create a vision, a positive vision for a vibrant Australia, looking at our bioregions and our catchments, understanding the damage that the colonial project has caused, and thinking through how we make things better. and how we build on the foundations of Indigenous knowledge, but also bring in all the good stuff that Western societies have to offer. The Green Print steps appear quite simplistic, but under each one is a deep analysis of many different tools that communities can use. This is a really terrible diagram just showing some of the places around Australia that communities are engaging with green prints and directly engaging in earth-centered governance, but doing it in a way that's place-based and brings all of it together so that we can build bioregions and connect with really these essence of ideas from earth jurisprudence and from Aboriginal knowledge about place. And we've also got a People's Tribunal which cuts across different issues, enabling citizens' inquiries to connect with ideas of earth democracy and earth-centered governance. And our next big citizens' inquiry, which is going to be epic, is looking across Australia's planning laws and how the pro-growth mentality of our industrialised structures continue today to devastate the living world. And there's so much more we can do. We can do so much better. And that is a whirlwind tour of some of the stuff we get up to. Thank you for listening. And what I'd like to do now is I will bring Carlotta and Margaret into the spotlight. You may or may not, depending on how you lovely folks are looking at your screen, but right now, so Carlotta and Margaret, let's have a chat. We've got a good 20 minutes or so before we have to wrap up, which is lovely. We've got some questions there. Thank you so much for collating them, Christina. So I might just start, if that's okay. Carlotta, I think the first question's for you. Was asking, are you working with Australian and other Pacific countries because there's so much understanding here? And in fact, my second question to that is, why does the Gaia Foundation focus almost solely on Africa when you're all based in London? You're on mute,
yeah, just unmuting myself. So our director, Liz Hoskin, is South African and actually spends much of the year in Africa. And we've been working in Africa, for over 2 decades because, Liz is South African and has a lot of connections, as you'd imagine, on the continent. I think there are a lot of parallels really between the work that's happening accompanied by the African Earth Jurisprudence Collective and the work that's happening in Australia. And it's great to see, Michelle, in your slides, you mentioning in your presentation Mary Graham and Anne Paulina and these crucial conversations that you've been having with both of them around first laws. And I think within the wider Earth Jurisprudence movement, there's a kind of small minority of people that are working on kind of first laws and the original laws of the land. And I think that certainly we have had some discussions, including with Michelle, around this theme, but there's a lot of a lot more kind of exchange and potential for learning, I think, between us that can happen. So I think future conversations between practitioners and those working in Australia on first laws would be really welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Carlotta. And in terms of the Pacific, I think the bottom line is so many countries have their own knowledge systems. Earth jurisprudence is powerful where it's needed, but in some places it's not needed. It's not the cure for all things. Thomas Berry's call is very much to particularly folks from the West to really rethink what our Western culture has done to our thinking and our connection to place. But yes, I think Gaia Foundation and Ayla, we've been in touch for a very long time, and there's lots of potential there. So there's a question here, which is an interesting one. I think it's for you too, Carlotta. Someone says, I'm interested in your thoughts on Indigenous communities who aren't as lucky to have retained their ancestral knowledge. And perhaps that speaks to the kinds of processes you're using to help people reconnect with their ancestral knowledge. So did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, as I said in the presentation, actually, these customary governance systems, this Indigenous knowledge has often been really undermined through colonization. So the communities that are accompanied by earth jurisprudence practitioners, often at the beginning, you know, those knowledge systems are broken, that knowledge has been undermined. And so it is a very slow process, as I said, of kind of bringing back the memory. And often it will begin with identifying the elders in community that are the knowledge holders. But it may be that at the very beginning, because a lot of this, these practices have been you know, marginalized and repressed and even demonized in cases, it may be that those elders are not sort of, you know, particularly confident about coming forward. So initially practitioners will, often they're working with their own communities, but it may be they're building relationship with new communities and beginning really by seeking out those elders and building relationship with those elders, and then initiating small dialogues, maybe with just a few elders at the beginning, and those dialogues are around sort of bringing back the memory and the collective knowledge, and those dialogues may happen regularly for several years and slowly build momentum and slowly be drawing in more and more members of the community. And as I said, the work is also sort of working holistically, but perhaps beginning with something like the question of seed. So, you know, what seed, what are our traditional crops and what are our traditional seeds, and who's still growing those seeds? Because of course a lot of people have moved to hybrid seeds. There's been a lot of pressure in these communities to adopt hybrid seeds and all of the pesticides and fertilizers that come with them, but who in the community still has those seeds? And then that will raise, you know, well, who's growing these seeds, and well, how is it that we grow with these seeds? How do we farm? How was it that we used to farm? But then also, you know, seeds are understood in many of these communities to be sacred. So, you know, as well as being used to grow crops, they are also kind of central to rituals. So then that will bring up questions around rituals, and, you know, what were the rituals that we used to do, and when did we used to do them, and why did we used to do them, and where, and then that will open up dialogue around sacred natural sites. So you know, often rituals will happen in these sacred natural sites. So then there'll be dialogues around our sites, and, you know, where are our sites, and you know, are they in good condition? Are they you know, being encroached upon? Are we following the laws? Because often with sacred natural sites, they're kind of off limits, and there are all sorts of laws around these sites. And, you know, for instance, you wouldn't hunt around a sacred natural site, you wouldn't disturb an ecosystem around a sacred natural site. So you can see how you begin with sort of, you know, something as small as seed, but from that very beginning, you can open up, and every sort of all aspects of cultural life are of course interconnected, and you end up kind of the emergent property, if you will, of these many dialogues is that you end up with a culture that is kind of slowly coming back to life. And we talk very much about kind of reweaving the basket of life, and this methodology that the practitioners adopt with community sort of has grown out of methodologies that were developed in the Colombian Amazon by communities that were also doing this slow and painful work of bringing back the indigenous governance systems. So I hope that gives a sense of maybe a way forward in that context.
It's a lovely answer. And certainly I've worked with a lot of different communities here in Australia, and some have significant amounts of their people and their culture intact, and others are also rebuilding. Some of the most interesting projects I've encountered in Australia is where people are rebuilding lost language. They may have some, but they're literally getting linguistic linguistic experts to help them take what's left and actually rebuild their language. So it's, I guess it's a nice reminder that culture isn't static. It grows and it is reborn and it is revived, and it has to sometimes change a little too. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Carlotta. Margaret, I have a question that's come in just to me, not into the public line there, about the work of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. And they've just asked, what are some of the current things that are most exciting when you look across the planet for rights of nature? That's a big question, Margaret. Would you like to speak to that a little bit? We have time.
Well, yeah, and the great thing is that it is such a big question now, you know,
Yes.
that there's so many examples that we can pull from. Currently in the legal hub, we're helping Greenpeace prepare an amicus for a case in Argentina where they are hoping to recognize the rights of jaguars, which hopefully will have, you know, larger implications. But their specific focus in this case is the destruction of the habitat that has led to significant declines in jaguar populations. So, you know, something like that, where the Supreme Court or the equivalent of our Supreme Court in Argentina has agreed to take on this case, you know, and to hear these arguments about whether non-human rights are supported in the legal authorities in Argentina. We believe they are, you know, and just the fact that that case was accepted is in and of itself, you know, very exciting. And so we've had quite a few developments recently in the United States. We've had large-scale public support for the application of a lot of these legal strategies. We've immediately been met with pushback from governments in Florida specifically. In 2020, we had almost 90% of the Orange County voters support a Bill of Rights for the local waterways here. Within, you know, very quickly, unfortunately, the state passed what they refer to as the Clean Waterways Act, which is a very misleading titled bill that actually prohibited any type of rights of nature governance.
Wow.
It said that, yeah, it's a preemption. That's a very common, you know, tactic here. And it actually prohibits local governments from providing rights to any, it's very specific, and plant, animal, you know, body of water. It really covered all the bases. So in terms of, you know, the work that the Global Alliance is doing, it's both, you know, very exciting to see all of these opportunities arise, but also what we're in the midst of right now is sort of reorganizing things, because it is becoming such a global phenomenon at this point. It is, just really, you know, gaining traction again.
I was just going to say, let's explain to people what that means, because 10 years ago when AILA started, 2012, all we could talk to people about was Ecuador and Bolivia and the Vilcabamba River case. And I would cling to these stories. And I actually got laughed at when I spoke at a legal conference in Australia, sort of scoffed at by people who today don't scoff anymore. And so there's been in 2017, the big change for Australia was when New Zealand, and although it's not rights of nature, it's come out of married cultural traditions, but when New Zealand recognized, you know, the Whanganui River, the longest case that had gone through the compensation courts and the Waitangi Treaty. But when the river got recognized in legal personhood, and then that all of these rights of nature branches and concepts have started to spring off. So for anyone who's not familiar with the origins of rights of nature, probably since 2017, New Zealand loves banging the drum for how they've exploded the whole thing. But now, how many countries, I mean, Christina and I are actually doing research on this. I'm trying to catch up with, we've been so busy building all these other aspects of AILA. I'm trying to get a handle on all the different countries that are exploring so many different ways. What do you think, Margaret, off the top of your head? Do you think it's 12? 13 more?
Officially, I would say about that. But we're actually, in terms of the reorganization of GARN, because, you know, there's so many different areas to focus on right now, we've created a hub network. And so we have both geographic hubs and thematic hubs. So, for example, I facilitate the legal hub. So there's no real geographic, restrictions on that. We also have the Academic Hub, and they are currently working on the Echo Jurisprudence Monitor to do exactly that, to compile all of the Earth jurisprudence, or Echo Jurisprudence, as they're referring to it, cases, not just cases, but instances around the world, so be it academic writing, be it, coursework, be it customary, laws, be it legal applications, so that, then we can really get this large scale picture of what's going on around the world. So it's very exciting. It's launching. It's already done sort of a soft launch, and they're working on it now. So I would definitely encourage anyone who's interested to check out the Garn website, garn.org, and find your way to the Academic Hub. They've got some amazing stuff going on.
That's great. And Alessandro Palazon, who's sort of leading that. But for folks who don't know, I used to be on the exec committee of the Global Alliance, but quite frankly, the work in Australia was taking up so much time, and the time zone for joining those meetings got a bit exhausting. But Alex and others are doing some terrific work there. So we'll be feeding through material into the AILA newsletters as well. So if folks get it at all confused about what the heck is going on, we'll do our best to communicate that too. Oliver has asked where the links are. I'll pop all the links in there, Oliver. And if you need to connect with us, and I should put this in there. Christina Dull, would you mind, can you just put in the ayla@earthlaws.org.au email address? If anyone's on tonight and you're keen to know more about the Gaia Foundation or CEJ and you're in Australia, get in touch with us. We'll put you onto them personally and connect you and point you to the right mailing lists to join, because there's so much going on in the world at the moment. It's fantastic. And that's actually my question back to both of you, and perhaps we can have a brief discussion about it, is what are you seeing in your own work in the last 5 years that's giving you most hope? Because the field of work that we're in has changed so much. Carlotta, let's go with you, because Margaret's already pointed out a few of the exciting things, but we'll come back to her.
Well, I think, as you say, there's just been this incredible flourishing of ecological legal initiatives, and the movement is incredibly diverse. We have activists, we have communities, we have organizations, we have lawyers, and I'm reminded of the Zapatista quote. So we want a world in which many worlds are present, and I think that's absolutely what we want in terms of the Earth Jurisprudence movement. So the Gaia Foundation is working very much on the revival of the indigenous governance systems in several countries in Africa, and as we've said, there are lots of parallels with exciting initiatives in Australia as well. But it's brilliant to see that there are communities that are asking the same questions. Clearly our legal systems are failing us, and how is it that we can reimagine them so that they are really supporting the health and integrity of our ecosystems, and also, by doing so, the health and integrity of the wide Earth community. And it's absolutely right that communities are then responding differently, so based on their own cultural context and their own ecological context, and based on an intimate relationship with the ecosystems, and ideally a sense of love for those ecosystems. Communities are stepping up and taking different approaches, from rights of nature laws and legal personhood mechanisms to pioneering court judgments, some of which have been made in contexts where the rights of nature actually are not recognized in statutes. But for instance, in Colombia, there have been some court judgments that have, in any case, kind of on the basis of the human right, for instance, to a healthy environment and other community rights, have gone that step further and decided to recognize the rights of nature. And then, we have the rights of Pachamama, we have the rights of Mother Earth, we have this kind of proliferation of different approaches. And I think, as we know, diversity is kind of a core principle of ecosystem health. And I think we can kind of understand the Earth Jurisprudence movement as this kind of thriving ecosystem with many diverse initiatives. And there's a lot to learn, and I think we need to be doing a lot more work on enforcement and implementation. But I think there's incredible energy and a lot of momentum around these initiatives that are kind of mushrooming up, and I really welcome that.
Yes, me too. And Margaret, yourself, what have you been noticing changing? One point you made in your talk was that you used to have to spend a lot of time explaining the beginnings of everything to your students, but now they get it. Did you want to elaborate on that? And what else has changed in 5 years, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, indirectly, that is really the most exciting part, is the interaction with the students and seeing how much they're gravitating towards these alternative legal concepts. So unofficially, you know, that would be the most exciting part of my work. But in terms of the, you know, things that are happening on the ground, you know, like we said, we've had many large-scale examples recently, you know, the Chilean Constitution, the Stockholm 50s, you know, Rights of Nature Declaration, things like that on very large scales. But I think that one of the most interesting applications I've seen in the United States was the recognition of the rights of a wild rice that was exactly. Yes. And this was by using that legal mechanism that was based in, you know, treaty law and customary law, and even the Clean Water Act, our big statutory, you know, water protection authority. They were able to stop a destructive activity, specifically pipelines. We have a very significant problem throughout the US of the fossil fuel pipelines being put through predominantly indigenous areas. And so when all other you know, legal attempts failed to stop this, you know, it all came down to the customary usage of a grain of rice that was able to, it's still, you know, in court, and it's still being argued, but, you know, with a pretty good legal argument for why that pipeline shouldn't go there. So I find those applications very interesting, and in marrying these sorts of, you know, different these different approaches, you know, where we focus mainly on the legal, but here it had more to do with a customary approach that ended up getting the results that were needed in that case. So yeah, despite our best attempts here, you know, at indigenous genocide, in the end, you know, in this particular case, that's become what's going to save, you know, potentially this very large area in terms of water resources. Because as we talked about earlier, you know, the significance of cultural genocide and, you know, that we've seen in colonized nations in the US, that's just as, you know, as prevalent as it is elsewhere, if not, you know, maybe a little more so than some other places. But, you know, yeah, it goes beyond just the traditional notion of genocide. What we've actively tried to do for centuries is to cut off, you know, the connection to these customary practices. And so I just find it very, very encouraging, and you know, it's you know, one area that I think is going to have great opportunity going forward.
Thanks, Margaret. And we had Thomas Lindsay and Mari Margle in a special webinar last week. I've worked with them for many years now, and they're very dear friends, but hearing their reflections, because I see them as the pioneers of rights of nature in Western law. And that's what they've said too, that really they've always seen the Indigenous space as kind of the moral space that's going to really build a lot of these ideas. So it's pretty exciting. And can I just, before I forget, give a plug to anyone listening today? I'm actually just going to show you there's a couple of other rights of nature this is our Earth Laws Month program. I know I won't freak you out, but there it is. And I'll put the link in again. We've had a lot of terrific events, and all the recordings will be available, but I'm just trying to find, that's this week. We've had Ecocide and many, many other awesome things. Next week on Thursday, we've got a different strain of kind of earth-centered law, which is the ecological law and governance gang with Jeff Garver and Katie and Carla Spurt talking about ecological law. And that's definitely connected to rights of nature, but is kind of looping a lot of it all together. And I just wanted to mention, where is it? Yeah, on the 29th, we've got a Rights of Nature symposium with a range of speakers, including Māori, folks from the Earth Law Centre and other places. So there's a whole bunch more info if people want to catch up with that. There was something else too, but I've forgotten. There's some more Ecocide sessions on too. So for anyone who is interested, there's so much going on, but there's a lot of terrific folks ready to tell you all about it. Margaret, are you able to speak for a moment about how you're teaching students about Earth jurisprudence and what are they doing with it later? Do you find that it's just generally informing their thinking and their practice, or are you finding that sometimes they are starting to volunteer into that space? I know there's not a lot of paid jobs in it yet, but what are you finding with your students?
Yeah, so we at the center, a few years ago, we realized that we didn't have a lot of opportunity to engage the students and prepare them for the practical application. It really was just theoretical courses and things like that. So what we've shifted over to in the past couple of years, we have our Earth Law and Policy Fellowship that the students can join, so that at least while they're in school, they can get some experience working with the local work that we're doing. We connect them with the organizations that we partner with to get that practical experience as much as is possible, and I have certainly written many recommendations for students to go on to, in the legal arena, and I have definitely seen a huge interest in how they can continue this work. There's usually a lot of disappointment that unfortunately at the center we are a very small group, and we can't take on everybody as much as we
have the same thing in AILA.
Exactly.
People love the work. So many people want to do this work. And they're not all as crazy as I am, because I did it for 9 years with no pay whatsoever, and only until the last year. But there's a lot of young'uns out there that want to do this work. And sorry, Margaret, I interrupted you with my enthusiasm.
Oh no.
but I wonder, do you get feedback from folks, say several years after being taught Earth jurisprudence, as to how they try to bring that earth-centeredness into their work, even when it's difficult?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the way that we are seeing it come to fruition, is that as much as we would love to, train advocates and throw them out into the field and get this movement, going farther, what it does turn out to be is that we have the opportunity to introduce even students who aren't necessarily interested in going into this area of law into the concepts and connecting them. I always start my classes asking what everyone's area of interest is, so we can make sure to make those connections between what we're talking about and how it applies. So yeah, I have that is where we're seeing, the actual application the most, is exactly that the students have been introduced to these concepts, and it's really just opened up their way of thinking, even if it's just the sense of being more critical of, the system that we're working with, maybe not necessarily having the solution just yet, but that ability to identify where the missing pieces are.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. That lovely old quote, a person's mind once stretched by a new idea can never go back to its original shape. I was finding when I was teaching undergrads that you could just see their heads were blown by challenging property law and, critiquing earth-centeredness. And just another quick plug for Ayla. This year we did our first professional development course called Earth-Centered Futures. And it's been really brilliant. That's terrific speakers. And it's just been really excellent. And what we're trying to do is weave those ideas into professional minds so that when they go into different spaces, and we've already been invited by a group of design and architect and planning grown-ups, not undergrads, to actually design a special course for that profession. So I think for us, that's going to be another area to infiltrate people's thinking in the earth-centered way, so in the Jedi way. Look, I'm aware that we've probably only got a couple of minutes left. Oliver, I see your lovely question about planning law in Tassie. Oliver, certainly I can happily answer a couple of those points, but do get in touch with us and send an email to Christina, because we're looking at because we're doing a citizens' inquiry into Australia's planning laws, and Christina and our team of law students and professional volunteers have literally been developing briefings on every single state and territory in Australia with planning laws. So we might be able to help you out a little bit. We're not going to answer your essay questions for you, but we can certainly chat with you. There might be some great ways to do that. I like that JP has put eccentric, ecocentrics unite. Absolutely. So I think, Oliver, your question is a very interesting one. And in fact, I was talking to a PhD student today about this idea of wilderness. So I'll just sort of shorten your question or paraphrase it. Do you have any advice on the topic of arguing that there's no such thing as wilderness and how that concept is a colonial hangover affecting First Nations peoples? First of all, yes. Second of all, the literature on this topic is huge. There's just so much material, and particularly in the Australian context, on challenging the notion of wild and the wilderness. So I can't rattle off any references at the moment. It's been too long a day and my brain's melting. But do send us an email. And like this PhD student I was talking to, she's from Minnesota and ended up working in Australia during COVID, crafted a PhD around challenging notions of the wild and wilderness. But she said once she started talking to Indigenous people, so in the Australian context, for those who don't know, talking about the wild wilderness is inferring that there are no people in a place. And that's deeply insulting and incredibly incorrect in the Australian context, because, and I don't think I showed the map, but every patch of Australia was someone's country. It was like their backyard. They knew it and still know it like the back of their hand. So concepts of wild and wilderness are very different in Australia, because the truer notion is custodial ethic. And Mary Graham calls it a sacralized custodial ethic, sacralized collaborative ecological ethic, meaning people have always been here, people look after the place. It's not wilderness, it's not remote, it's not human free. So yes, Oliver, you've got a good topic there. If you do a lit review, it's going to really freak you out because there's so much material, but we'll definitely share. Eva Elbers is sharing interesting read on wilderness, Western culture and religion. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, there's so much stuff, particularly in the US and Australia. I can't speak for other parts of the world. Speaking of other parts of the world, Carlotta Byrne, so you're sitting in a beautiful garden there in Berlin. I was just wondering, although Gaia does a lot of work in Africa, what's the hot gossip on earth jurisprudence and rights of nature in Europe? Some of the rights of nature stuff I was aware of seems to have gone a bit quiet. Who's active in Europe? I'd hate to put you on the spot, actually. You might say, I don't know, I'm too busy working on African issues. Can you comment on what's going on in Europe, perhaps?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't focus on Europe myself, so I know that there is quite a lot happening. Of course, there's the recent Mar Menor case, which is really exciting. So the Mar Menor in Spain, a lake has been declared to be a legal person with a whole series of rights, and that is, I think, the first rights in nature law to be enshrined in a European legal context. And then there are, of course, lots of other initiatives, various kind of citizens' declarations around the rights of particular ecosystems. In the UK, we don't have any rights of nature laws, but there was a bylaw that was proposed, and that was in relation to the River Frome in Somerset, and it was passed by Frome Council, but then was rejected by the minister, so wasn't passed into law. But certainly there's a strong movement of communities in the UK that are coming together in relation to a particular ecosystem, and it's a river, and I think that's sort of part of a pattern that we see beyond Europe as well. And these communities are declaring themselves as guardians of that particular ecosystem. In some cases, they're also declaring the rights of that particular ecosystem, and then regardless of the fact that these rights are not enshrined in law, they are kind of actively protecting those rights, coming together and looking after their ecosystem, and also using kind of the laws that are in place to take a sort of different approach to protect those rights, because of course there are other legal avenues out there. So I think there is a lot happening, but kind of maybe it's less visible kind of in terms of black letter law, but a lot actually happening within community. And I must say, what excites me most, coming back to your original question, is really when communities are getting excited by the rights of nature and coming together to declare their love for particular ecosystems, and to then act together to protect and restore those ecosystems, because I think ultimately that's what it's about. We don't want transformation that is kind of paper thin. There's lots of beautifully crafted legislation out there, but if it's not resulting in change on the ground and protection of ecosystems on the ground, then I think we have to sort of ask questions, really. So ultimately we want transformation that is kind of about consciousness and culture, and if law and policy can come in to support that, that's brilliant, but it's certainly not an endpoint in itself.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And certainly here in Australia, what I'm excited about is the Blue Mountains City Council. We worked with them because communities were very interested, and they basically passed a resolution stating that they were adopting the rights of nature as an operational principle in council operations, which doesn't sound like much, but local councils can't actually technically pass their own laws on many things, including environmental protection. And this is the beginning of discussing with communities what they're interested in. And for others in Australia, the Hawkesbury Nepean waterkeeper folks are working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members, and they were bringing us in for a workshop to explore what earth laws could look like for them. Here in Australia, we already have the Yarra River, the Birrarong Council recognised as a living entity, not changing the legal status, but yeah, really exciting. I have to admit, I have, for the first time in my professional career, completely got our times wrong. I was meant to let you all go at 7:30. I'm so sorry. I'm so used to our night webinars being 6:30 to 8 p.m. I've tortured you here for 2 hours. Oh my goodness. One of my colleagues just pointed out, weren't we meant to finish at 7:30? I'm so sorry. We will wrap up now at 8 o'clock, however. Thank you so much for staying with us for so long. Someone says, don't stop now. Oh my God, no. I feel terrible because I think Carlotta's got a full day, and Margaret, I don't even want to know. You must be just ready to go back to bed. But look, on that note, we will start to wrap up. And people are saying bonus. Yeah, I've never done that before. Must be starting to get a bit loopy with webinar fever. So it has been an absolute delight to talk to amazing women working in Earth Jurisprudence, and to share the stories from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance too. We must do this much more often. But for now, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. And please do get in touch with Ayla, the Gaia Foundation, Centre for Earth Jurisprudence, and Garn directly. And if you get lost and can't work your way out to see which other groups, track us down at Ayla and we'll tell you more. Yeah, thanks, Christina. And a final huge thank you to Carlotta and to Margaret for joining us from different parts of the planet. 3 cheers for Zoom and allowing us to meet up relatively carbon-free. So I'll let you guys and girls say goodbye. Sorry, I always say guys and girls. Carlotta and Margaret, if you'd like to say goodbye, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, please go ahead.
Yeah, just thank you so much, everyone, for joining this discussion today. Lots of rich ideas. It's been brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been great. And I didn't even notice, like I said, if I really have to set alarms for myself, because I will talk forever about this topic. So
I think that's why we get along so well. I'm exactly the same. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for our epic webinar. And have a lovely day to our guest speakers in other places, and to all the Aussies. Go, fly, be free, go and have some dinner or a cup of tea. So thank you so much, everybody. Good night.